Hello, my name's Genevieve Collins and I'm studying ancient history. I'm doing an independent study on Roman food and I'm going to demonstrate how I've adapted a Roman recipe for the modern kitchen. In this video, I'm going to be cooking whilst answering some questions about how I've adapted Roman recipes.
So what are you cooking for us today, Jenny?
The main focus of the video is going to be on pork cooked with sweet wine cakes. However, I'll also be making marinated lamb with a Roman sauce and some Roman cheese.
Sounds delicious. So this is the pork with sweet wine cakes. Where's the recipe from?
The recipe comes from Apicius's recipe book, although he doesn't actually tell you how to make the sweet wine cakes. So I had to look up the recipe somewhere else and I found it in Cato's treatise on agriculture. I'm just beginning by adding the barley and the figs to the water, and I'm going to boil it all up together so that it all cooks.
And you're using a modern cooker.
I'm using a modern cooker because it isn't really practical to make up a Roman stove. However, they would have been able to use all the same kind of techniques that we have, like using an oven and boiling. Apicius used a method of simmering where he'd put his pan on the hot flames and then he'd take it off and put it back on so that the heat wasn't too hot and the meat would just simmer nicely. The Romans used to have pans that either had legs or sat on tripods at different levels above the flames. So if they wanted something to cook faster, it would have been lower down on the flames, or if it wanted to cook it slower, they would have had it higher above the flames. They also would have used the coals, like we use with a barbecue, to cook some things, and they would have been able to put the pan straight onto a griddle on the coals. And they also used to cook, once the coals had turned into ash, they would have also cooked things in the ash, such as vegetables and eggs. While the pork is boiling, I'm going to start making the sweet wine cakes.
And have you got all the same ingredients?
Well, the ingredients I'll be using are, I've got wheat flour, which they would have used, and butter or lard. I'm using butter. The other ingredients are bay leaves, which I have ground cumin and aniseed. The only thing that I don't have is must, which was a grape juice which began to ferment as soon as it had been pressed. This would have meant that the cakes would have been able to rise. But as I don't have any must, I'm going to be mixing some yeast in with the cakes in order so they'll rise in the oven.
Have you adapted the method in any way?
I have with this one. The recipe says to begin by mixing the flour with the wine. However, I found it works a lot better if you mix the butter and the flour together so that it resembles breadcrumbs, a bit like when you make scones, and then add in the other dry herbs and then mix in the wine last in order to bind it all together.
And how many people does this recipe serve?
The problem with Roman recipes is that they don't usually have many quantities and it doesn't say how many people it'll serve. So I've adapted the recipe so that it'll serve 4 people. Okay, now the pork's boiled, we're going to take it out of the water and put it in another dish, cover it in honey and then stick it in the oven to cook for a bit longer.
Why did you choose pork, Genevieve?
I chose pork because pork was the most commonly eaten meat by the Romans.
And what will you do with the figs and was it barley?
I'm going to drain the water out and then just leave them for now, and then when the pork's cooked it's going to be served all together.
Yum.
Do you think I should put tin foil over it?
Did the Romans have tin foil?
No.
Actually, when we cook pork today, do we put tin foil over it?
Yes. No? I always do. I'm now just rolling out the dough into little balls and putting it on a bay leaf like the recipe says before I put it all in the oven together.
And the meat's going in at the same time.
Yep, we just need the meat to brown off a bit more before cooking it. Now those are in the oven, I can make the sauce that will accompany both of them for the main dish. I'm now going to show you how you make the sauce, which we're going to pour over the pork and the sweet wine cakes. The sauce is probably the hardest thing to make because there aren't any instructions about how to make it or what quantity of ingredients to use. The ingredients are raisin wine, rue, normal wine and pepper. Notoriously, Roman food is very peppery, but I found that if you put any more than a teaspoon in, it makes it pretty much unbearable to eat, so I'm only putting in a teaspoon. The raisin wine I made by just soaking raisins for about 24 hours in normal wine. Rue is really hard to find now, but it was used a lot in Roman cookery. It had quite a bitter taste, and I found out that parsley is quite a good substitute, so I'm going to be using that instead. To make it, we just boil up all of the ingredients together. We also need a bit of normal wine that isn't raisin wine. Once it's come to the boil, we then just let it simmer for a bit to thicken, and I'm also going to add some corn flour just to thicken it up a little bit.
So did the Romans have different courses, Genevieve?
Yes, the Romans had 3 different courses. They had sort of starter, aperitif sort of things, which would be things like the olive relish, which I've made. Then they would have had what they called the first mensa, which means table, because they would have brought in a new table for each course, and that would have been things like the lamb that I've made and the pork. And although they would have drank wine with this, they would have only had a little bit, whereas with the second mensa they would have had lots of wine. It would have been more about the drinking of the wine than the eating of the food. And although they would have had some sweet things like sweet cheesecake, they mostly had more savoury food. Now everything's cooked, they would have served it up like this all together with the barley and the figs and the sweet wine cakes, and then with the sauce poured mainly over the wine cakes, and then also the remaining sauce would be poured over the meat. This is olive relish I made using an authentic Roman recipe. What did you think of it?
I thought it was absolutely delicious. What went into it?
It's got olives, coriander, cumin, fennel. We didn't have any rue, so instead I substituted it for pine nuts because rue has quite a piney smell, so I've often just put in pine nuts instead of rue, and vinegar and plenty of oil to cover it, which they would have done in Roman times in order so that it would keep well.
Genevieve, what have you found out about Roman food during this project?
I found that it's very hard to recreate Roman food from the recipes because of the lack of quantities of ingredients they put. In interpreting the recipe, you have to test it out quite a few times before you decide on how you want it to be at the end. Also, it's hard to get some of the things that they use, such as the garum or rue, because it's just not things that we have today.